Mustafa, thank you so much for joining the podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Lewis, for the invite. Looking forward to our conversation.
So I'd like to just kick this off because this is as I just mentioned in our preamble, this is a beast of a topic, resilience. This is going to be it's one really close to my heart. I'm passionate about it. But I think on a regular basis, I am speaking to people that this word is thrown around so much. And I want to use this podcast to really dive into a lot of your research, what you found, your experience. But to lay the groundwork, let's talk a little bit about you, your background, even your sporting background, and why the passion of going into research in resilience. So the floor is open. Start wherever you want to start there, my friend.
Yeah, so I guess as a starting point, I got into sport probably 7, 8 years old. Predominantly cricket was my main sport. And I guess when I was 14, 15 years old, on the brink of age group county, and really, had a real big passion for cricket. Was technically and tactically very, very good. I was a leg spin bowler, and technically and tactically brilliant. In fact, probably better than my peers at that age group. But actually, something that I really struggled with was actually the psychological aspect of it. So, in particular, coach feedback I really, really found difficult, and also converting my training performances and putting that into competition. And that kind of, I guess, although probably not consciously, probably slightly unconsciously, that's what probably got me into wanting to understand the psychological aspect of sport, and probably got me interested in sports psychology as a topic to start off with. And then obviously from that, thinking about resilience as well.
Just for people who don't even know cricket, I know I talk about it a lot on the podcast, but leg spin bowling, it is the hardest skill in the sport. It is, as a bowler, that is one of the hardest skills you do. And funny enough, whether you knew this or not, as a youngster, you need a hell of a lot of resilience to do that role, because it takes, I know professionals who have played the game that they haven't actually kicked into their sort of, I don't know, what we would say is fifth gear of their ability until they hit around about the 28, 29, maybe older. Actually, I think they've spoken about that leg spinners can really sort of mature in their early 30s, because it takes that long to develop the skill. And one of the deterrents, you hear a lot about it, is the fact that when kids don't get it right, because it looks so ugly, it looks so wrong, it can be really damaging to their psyche, because you're just getting whacked out of the park. It can look ugly. It requires a lot of resilience. Like, did you know? You probably experienced that pretty early on.
Yeah, and I think for me, and we'll totally talk about this in terms of how you might go about developing resilience. Yes, there's probably things I could have done better myself as an individual. In terms of, a lot of the time I was overthinking my routine and overthinking my delivery. So there's probably lots of psychological skills that, if I had that knowledge, and I, for example, saw a sports psychologist, and obviously, when I was playing, that was 15 years ago. So sports psychology was still pretty infant. So I think there was, definitely lots of things I could have done psychologically to ensure that I was able to perform under those pressure moments and situations. But I also think, from a resilience point of view, the environment that was created around me by coaches, by other, staff, I think even the fact of just giving me a few more chances, I feel as if what happened in my journey was, I remember one kind of county trial game. I still remember really, really distinctly my first over, it was my first or second over. In training, I was able to, the typical leg spin delivery, outside of leg stump going straight into off stump. Absolutely perfect, Shane Warne type balls. I was able to do relatively consistently in training. But then my first or second over in competition, 4 out of the 6 balls, full tosses.
Right.
And then I still remember, I think then I was either dropped or just wasn't given an opportunity to then build on that and kind of work on that ability to then convert my training into competition. And even, putting myself in training, for example, as coaches, putting me under pressure. I know you can never replicate competition in training to the level, that level of, degree, but doing as much as I can in training or with coaches to actually put myself under pressure. So actually, when it came to competition, it wasn't this really, really big thing that, was going to be really, really difficult. So I think, definitely individually, I think could have been a lot of work done. But similarly, I think environmentally, setting up the environment that could have helped my resilience, I think, on reflection, could have played a role as well.
I know we'll get on to a lot of especially your challenge support matrix and creating facilitative environments. But for you, if you can put yourself back as a kid, because there's no doubt going to be someone here who will resonate with that. And do you know what? Even I do. I resonate with that. I resonate with the fact that when I was younger, I wasn't necessarily the best player in the team, and I think there will be so many young athletes that will put themselves under so much pressure to perform like now, and that could be their own individual, them doing that themselves. But it sounds like the coaches were creating that for you. Can you kind of put yourself back into what that kid was thinking and saying to himself when all of this was going on?
I think for me, the real regret might be a bit of a strong word, but I guess the sad thing was I stopped enjoying my love of the sport. In particular, the coach feedback that I mentioned, that the bit I really, really struggled with was at the age of 13, 14, coaches, particularly actually county coaches, not actually my club coaches. My club coaches were brilliant. Really had a really good experience. But when I said kind of trialing for county, talking about feet movement, putting your feet there instead of there, talking about literally angles in terms of feet movement. As a 14-year-old kid, you're not interested in that kind of technical aspect of it. You're there to just have fun. You're there to, bowl, have, so the social element of it, the team element of it. So I guess for me, looking back, you look at, England, I don't follow it kind of massively as much as I probably used to, but, that freedom to play that I think if you look at the England team at the moment, yes, things might not always work out, but the idea that you give that individual the freedom to take risks, the freedom to try new things without that kind of fear of judgment or retribution. And I guess all I would have wanted was just a little bit more opportunity to show my development, I guess. If coaches or counties, give players 2 or 3 opportunities, they work with them, they give 2 or 3 opportunities and it still doesn't work out. I understand at some stage they're having to make, decisions around selection, etc. But it felt like with my one, I was, one opportunity, I didn't perform, let's move on. And that seemed, again, I was never going to make it at the elite level. So don't get me wrong, I'm not being bitter about it. I don't think I was good enough anyway to make it. But I do feel as if they need to give young people more of a chance, because we know from the research, just because you are good at just your junior success or even your junior performances don't necessarily predict your senior performances. So I think we need to be aware of that, I think, in terms of when we're working with young people, I think.
I am so glad you said that. I am so glad that you have said that, because I have to keep reminding people so often that when you make it into a professional environment, no one cares who was the best under 14. No one cares the runs you scored at an under 15, the goals you scored as a 15-year-old, the matches you won as a 16-year-old. They care about what you can do right now and what you can offer in that environment. And I think especially parents, I think parents go back to, my child was this champion at this age group. And I always kind of listen to it and go, yeah, but what about now? What characteristics do they hold now that taught them or they use now, and what are they doing now? More often than not, that person is not playing at a high level. And we can maybe delve into that down the line in this conversation about what attributes create athletes that don't have resilience, that potentially have had it easy, have had that success early, and what's the outcome there? But before we go there, it sounds like your passion came from your own personal experience, but then you went into psychology, into sports psychology, and then your research developed into resilience. Just give us a little bit of a background into that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I guess even before going into sports psychology, as quickly as I can, I'll mention that actually my initial application to university was to do law.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I went to a very, very high-performing boys' school in North London, and actually probably faced quite a lot of peer pressure to do what I would kind of call traditional subjects. So all my peers around me were doing things like law, medicine, business, etc. And I came across sports science in a magazine. I don't know, your listeners will be aware of a tennis player called Barry Cowan. So
I'm not even aware of Barry Cowan.
Barry Cowan is a British tennis player who I think was about 250th in the world in relation to this story I'm going to mention. And he took Pete Sampras to Wimbledon. He took Pete Sampras to 5 sets at Wimbledon.
Wow!
And the interviewer at the end asked him, how did you do so well? You're 250th in the world. Pete Sampras is number 1 in the world. How did you do so well? And Barry Cowan said, I've been working with a sports psychologist, and what he was doing, he was actually listening to music in between games to help him with his focus and concentration. And that was really the first time I came across sports science. I read about this in a magazine, and I came across sports science. I thought, I really like sport. I really like science. I ended up not getting into law school. That was a blessing in disguise. I ended up taking a gap year, worked at PwC actually, and that was a really good experience. And then, went to Loughborough to do initially it was a sports science undergraduate degree. And then I specialized in sports psychology at my master's. And then obviously after my master's, my PhD. And I guess the reason I got into resilience was probably because of my sporting experience, and just to better understand why is it that some athletes are able to perform under pressure, whereas people like myself actually succumb to that pressure and actually underperformed. And that's kind of got me both my personal experiences, but also from a research point of view, with my supervisor at the time, realizing the fact that there wasn't actually that much research looking at resilience in sport. So when I did my master's, which was in 2010, there was only one research paper from America in 2008 that actually had looked at resilience in sport. There has been a lot of resilience research in other areas of psychology, so social psychology, developmental psychology, organizational psychology. But apart from this one paper in 2008, no other resilience research in sport. So I guess it was a combination of two things. It was a combination of the personal experiences and wanting to understand it better, but also from a research point of view, realizing there's a little bit of a gap here. We need to kind of increase our evidence base in this area. And I guess then from there, my kind of resilience research is kind of initially focused on individual resilience at my master's, my PhD, etc. And then since looking at individual resilience, we've now started to look at resilience at the group or team level. And then also taking that one step further to looking at organizational resilience as well. That's kind of been a little bit of the journey kind of so far. It's kind of resilience at kind of different levels, at the individual level, at the group level, and at the organizational level.
Makes sense to do it that way around as well. I think probably actually a good order to do it. But the lack of research that was there initially, do you think, just sort of throwing an idea out here, do you think that was because, I don't doubt people kind of already talking about resilience and talking about bouncing back from adversity and overcoming a failure or setback. I have no doubt that has been in the human conversation for a while. But do you think people maybe thought of it as something that you're either just inherently born with, you can't change, and then once you've got it, you've got it, and if you don't, you don't?
Yeah, I think that could potentially be a reason. So people might be thinking, is it traits actually as a result, is it worth kind of investigating to understand how it can be developed? I guess maybe another part of it was probably since about the 2000s, there has been a growing body of research looking at mental toughness.
Yeah.
And some people might argue that, there are some similarities between mental toughness and resilience. But I guess the reason why I'm always a bit hesitant with mental toughness is that's probably a phrase I hear a lot whenever I do work with teams and organizations with coaches, because I guess it's a phrase that people in lay terms will speak about. I guess the issue for me with the word toughness suggests that if you're not tough, does that then mean you're weak? So I'm not generally a fan of mental, and also actually mental toughness has actually not come from. It's been starting to be researched because actually coaches are using that term, but there's no actual foundational or conceptual underpinning to that actual term. Whereas resilience has always been studied since the 1980s in developmental and social psychology. It's got a real strong conceptual and theoretical foundation to it. But I guess for me, that's possibly why maybe resilience hadn't been looked at, is because at the same time in the 2000s, as I said, the work around mental toughness was starting to be developed a little bit further.
So what is resilience?
Yeah. How long have you got?
Yeah.
Yeah, as you mentioned at the start, Lewis, it has become a bit of a buzzword. And I think for me, the reason why that question's so important is because the danger of resilience being a bit of a buzzword is the word resilience is starting to be lost in translation. So whenever I mention it, I kind of say that it's really important to ensure not only what it is, but also what it's not. I'm happy to go into some of the myths and misconceptions, but in very simple and practical terms, whenever I talk about resilience, I talk about it as the ability to maintain functioning when you're under pressure. And then crucially in the sport context, when we're talking about functioning, we're talking about not only performance, but also well-being. So the ability to maintain our performance and well-being when under pressure. In simple terms, that's how I would, or that's what the research would kind of talk about in a practical sense.
So you're talking about it there from an in the moment perspective, or can you even place that into a after? So again, let's say you've lost a match, whatever sport you've played, or you've not had a performance that you wanted to go your way. You're now sitting in your bedroom, or you're back at the training ground the next day. You're a little bit more demotivated. The idea of resilience being bouncing back from an adversity, can you place what you're talking about there into different sort of time categories?
Yeah, and I think you mentioned bouncing back. I'm always a bit hesitant with the term bouncing back, because I think for me, bouncing back suggests resilience being about reacting when something goes wrong. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think for me, thinking about resilience a little bit more proactively, it's not necessarily just about reacting when things go wrong, but also proactively putting plans and strategies in place for when things potentially might end up being quite difficult or challenging. So I prefer to think about resilience, as a more proactive skill or capacity, rather than just a reactive thing about, bouncing back when you hit a setback or when you hit an adversity. I guess also with the nature of the definition, when we're talking about maintaining functioning when under pressure, the pressure could be anything. That could be competition, that could be internal expectations, external expectations. And I guess the crucial thing around resilience is that resilience is what I would call a dynamic process. So it's, as you said, it's not something that's fixed. It's not a trait that you either have or you don't have. It's something that is context specific. So our resilience can change from situation to situation. Like using my example, my resilience in training was really good, but my resilience in competition wasn't so great. So we need to understand resilience in relation to the specific context. Even thinking about it in a general sense, how we react and respond to pressure in work or in our sport might be very different to how we react and respond to pressure in our personal life. And that's why when I hear people using the term resilient, I'm really hesitant when people label people as that kid is resilient or you're not very resilient, because it suggests that it's something you either have or don't have, and it's static and there's nothing you can do about it. So one aspect of it is it's context specific. It can change from situation to situation. But also, as you mentioned, resilience as a process suggests that it's time dependent. Our resilience levels can either increase or decrease over time. And I think that's a really important aspect when we're thinking about resilience as well.
I know you found a load of sort of personality personality traits that someone who shows resilience can have. And I mean, going through the list, it was a long list of things. It was almost a ton of psychological skills that were thrown in there as well, and mental skills that people can use. But I want to kind of circle back slightly. I know you don't like the term, but in your own research or mind, how would you differentiate between resilience and mental toughness? How do you really create that difference in what you found and how you describe it?
Yeah, I think for me, often similar to what you said about resilience in terms of those personal qualities or those psychological factors, a lot of the time with mental toughness, yeah, as you said, it's a combination of psychological factors that help people to perform under pressure. I guess for me, where we've tried to move some of the resilience, and again, this is backed up by the research as well, is that often mental toughness is very much placed on the individual. So it's the individual that have got these collection of psychological skills or characteristics that enables them to be mentally tough, for example. Whereas I think with the resilience research, what we're finding is that it's not solely an individual responsibility, but actually resilience is very much what I would call relational. So resilience is actually dependent on developing high quality relationships. But also we know that resilience is environmental. So the conditions that are created in the environment can actually facilitate someone's resilience or can actually undermine someone's resilience. So I think for me, that's another differentiating factor, is that mental toughness very much places the responsibility on what the individual can do. Whereas I think with resilience, we're talking about it as a more holistic, more broader concept where actually there's lots of different pieces to it. There's the individual aspect, there's the social aspect, and also there's the environmental aspect as well.
Yeah. So at the start, you said you started off with individuals, and then you've gone on to organizations. So if there is someone out there that is, or actually, I'm going to put a pin in that part of it. I would actually say, why is it at the moment that I'm hearing a lot and having conversations with a lot of, whether it's coaches, leaders in business, could be even teachers, but they're saying we've currently got a lot of individuals that are just not able to handle with the pressures. They're not able to come back and have another go. They're so fearful, they're so anxious, and then they say they're not very resilient. They don't have much resilience. And I reckon I walk through the halls of many schools going and giving talks and meeting with these teachers, and you will always see their values. There will always be resilience. I always guarantee there'll be respect and resilience will be there. What do you think is going on at the moment?
Oh, there's probably lots of bits. It's probably hard for me to kind of say, I can't necessarily put something specific to it. I guess without wanting to use this, I know this is used quite a lot, but obviously COVID has had an impact, I would say, in terms of, obviously I work at a university and, even seeing some of our students, small things, I say small things, but actually, students during COVID weren't having those kind of social interactions and developing those kind of social and personal skills. They, in a university setting, in a school setting, they weren't having, being put under exam pressure, for example. We're getting still, final year students who are still really, really struggling with things like doing presentations because they've just not had those skills and experiences, I guess, over the last, at a really important time in terms of their development. If we're talking about 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, in that kind of time period, that's a really, really important part in terms of someone's development. And if they've missed out on some of those opportunities, I think that's also played a really important role. One thing I'm also, and this goes back to the environment, I do think we've got to be careful that we're not spoon feeding. Because going back to you mentioned the kind of the challenge support matrix that we've developed, I think we're giving people a lot of support, but probably not providing enough challenge. And it's not just about, hammering people with, difficult things without giving them the support. I think the support bit is really, really important. But I think people need to experience, particularly early on in terms of their development and their journey, they need to experience some sort of difficulty. So I use the analogy of speed bumps. There need to be some speed bumps along the road, so that when they've experienced that, and also the support around that to ensure that they've developed skills, they've done some good learning and reflection from those experiences, so that when they face a greater speed bump along their journey later on the line, they've then got the ability to then actually react and respond in a kind of a helpful and a constructive manner. So I think young people are possibly, a lot of support, but possibly not enough challenge in terms of that journey.
I think that's been a really common theme with athletes that have come on the show that have talked about their stories. And I would guarantee that almost 100% of them they will talk about, I faced this when I was younger. I had some coach tell me I was no good. I had a performance that really hurt me, or whatever it might be. There's been a challenge. There's been this speed. And ironically, I did an episode previous to this around injury. So I had injuries when I was really young, and I had a really bad injury when I was 16. And it basically gave me this question of, do I want this? And this is what I've got to do in order to overcome it. I'm in physical pain right now. I've got to overcome this to do this. And I had to make the decision. You just get the choice to make that decision. And I chose to go down the slightly harder road, much harder road. And I look back at that and I go, that is a speed bump that you're talking about. That is a moment that I layered on resilience, because quite simply, I now have the confidence that if I do get injured, which it has happened a lot in my life so far, I don't I get injured, I can accept it a lot quicker. I can then move on. I can just do the right things straight away. But I'm also, and it was, again, I felt kind of bad saying it. I always said, I hope that a young athlete faces not a career-ending injury, but something that just knocks them, just to test them, just to like, okay, you're not bulletproof. What do you got? What can you do? That's sort of a speed bump.
We know, Lewis, actually, from the research that I'm sure everyone's seen this diagram where, path A to path B, that straight line.
Yes, yeah.
And then obviously the reality is not that straight line. The plan is a straight line, but the reality is these ups and downs that get you from A to B. And I often use that really to highlight that actually resilience is about helping individuals to react to those ups and downs. Part of resilience, is reacting to those ups and downs. But going back to the proactive nature of resilience, I think resilience is also proactively putting those speed bumps or ups and downs in place in an appropriate way, where it's not just about providing the speed bump, but then providing the learning and reflection that might come from that speed bump, debriefing with individuals. And we know from the research that high achievers actually have faced challenge along their journey. And crucially, they found that a really important part in terms of their subsequent success. So, I think that's a really important part, helping individuals to navigate some of those challenges and where appropriate. And actually, a lot of the time, it's those high achievers who've not encountered, like going back to the junior versus the senior. You might be a brilliant junior, but actually, when you come to the senior level, if you then face a speed bump, if you've not faced any speed bumps in that junior playing time, you come to that senior stage and you come across a difficulty. Those who haven't encountered any of that are going to find that really, really challenging. The other part, which I think is actually really interesting from a school university perspective and also from a perspective, is I think we've got to be careful that we label, you've mentioned, and I've heard this from other people, that, young people are just not resilient anymore. Because is it that we've got to contextualize that they might not be resilient for this situation, for this time point, but actually they might demonstrate resilience in another situation at another particular time point. And if I give a practical example of that, we have a lot of students who we find they struggle a lot of the times academically. But before they've come to university, they've actually come from some very, very difficult, challenging personal circumstances and backgrounds. So in my mind, I'm always thinking they've actually had to demonstrate resilience in their personal life, but they've just not been able to transfer what they've learned in their personal life to their academics or to their sport or whatever it might be. And I talk about this notion of the transfer of resilience. We can't automatically assume that if someone demonstrates resilience in one situation, that they're automatically going to develop it in another situation. And I think, in clubs and in schools, we need to teach that transfer of resilience from one situation to another situation, rather than just automatically assuming that people are going to just learn from those experiences. So I think that's for me another interesting aspect of it is how resilience can be transferred from one context to another context, one time point from another time point.
That is so interesting, and I 100% agree in the fact that I even just think back at my own journey, and people would tell me I was resilient, but I was like, well, you're seeing this from the context of me playing sport, of having failures in that, of getting injured, doing things like that. But I was like, if you saw me in a maths lesson, like, you'd think this kid is pathetic. Like, this is the least resilient kid ever. He's not interested in it. He's not going to try and achieve something, but it is because there was no passion for it. There was no motivation in that area. So yeah,
I use the same example, Lewis, with DIY. Like, if you saw me like in a work situation, I'm absolutely, whenever I face rejections or whatever, I'll always think, okay, there's another way around it. I can be flexible, etc. DIY, give it a go. If it doesn't work first time round, I give up straight away. But that, for me, just shows the importance of realizing that actually in one context, it will differ from another context. And we've got to be really careful when we provide that label, because then it suggests that if you label someone as resilient, you're suggesting, or not resilient, you're suggesting that that's the same situation across, or the same thing across all situations, across all time points. But that's just not the case. So just being more careful with language where we say that person has got higher, not even necessarily high, but higher resilience when they are dealing with expectations at this time point. But actually, when they are injured, they might be showing lower levels of resilience at this particular time. But I think just making sure we're really specific when we're talking about it, I think does make a difference.
And this is where you start to talk about it being a dynamic process and it fluctuating. It makes total sense. I love the fact that you talk about it being proactive, and especially it's a really tangible way to look at it, going from junior to senior sport, because if you think about that junior going into quite literally into a new changing room, like I just remember it myself again, right? You're just walking into a senior changing room. You're a junior. This is the first time you're doing it. And there could be moments called upon you with high challenge, and maybe even some levels of, in the moment, low support, because they kind of want to see you perform. And I think if you see it as you're walking in that room with not only your physical bags, but like this, not for a better word, a toolkit of everything you've learned from past experiences, you're so better equipped for that. And I see that both as now as a senior athlete in a team that I play in, and I see juniors coming in. You can just genuinely tell when they come in, just from the way they talk, the way they interact with people, like, this kid has had something go on, and there's a resilience within them. And let's see what happens here in senior sport. It doesn't guarantee any success or anything like that, but it just might make the mental experience for them a lot easier. Yeah. So for an individual, let's take an individual. I know we can talk about environments and coaches and things like that, but in an individual, if I'm an individual listening to this and going, I feel low on resilience, I want to develop resilience, what are some of the best ways in which I can do that? And what would potentially resilience, or from what you've seen, what does resilience look like in people? I know that's a very broad question because it can turn, but if I'm an individual wanting to develop it, what would be the advice?
Yeah, so I guess there are two bits in the individual. We've got a framework where we talk about there are three components of resilience development: the personal qualities, the facilitative environment, and what we call a challenge mindset. And the two bits of that framework which are related to the individual are the personal qualities and the challenge mindset. I'll probably focus on the challenge mindset because I think there's some really practical things that individuals can kind of do in relation to that.
I'd really love you to describe the ABCs here, if you could.
So I think, you asked what does resilience actually look like? I think ultimately, if we're talking about resilience as the ability to maintain functioning when we're under pressure, is the challenge mindset is this idea that individuals view pressure as an opportunity rather than viewing pressure as a threat. And again, in practical terms, you hear athletes talking about pressure being a privilege. I really like that phrase, that actually you've earned pressure being a privilege. You've kind of earned that pressure, and you're actually seeing that as an opportunity, as a challenge, as an opportunity to show your potential and to develop, rather than actually viewing pressure as a threat to your performance and your well-being. And I guess in terms of how you might develop that as an individual, I think the first exercise that I think is really, really useful, and I'm sure people have heard about this from a sports psychology point of view, in terms of controlling the controllables. So recognizing what is in your control and recognizing what is not in your control. But crucially, from a mindset point of view, realizing that although you can't control the situation, you can control how you react and respond to that situation. And that's ultimately what the challenge mindset is about. And the ABCs that you mentioned is very much based on cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, which is about recognizing that it's our thoughts and our beliefs that influence how we feel and behave, not the actual event itself. So if I give the example that I often give here is AIM often stands for the activating event or the adversity. So I didn't get selected for the team, for example. I didn't get selected for the cricket team. You might then feel sad and want to give up practicing. But what we do as humans is we associate those feelings and behaviors with the event. So I feel sad, I want to give up because I didn't get selected. But what we don't realize is that when we go through any kind of event, we have certain beliefs and thoughts about that event. So I didn't get selected. Your inner voice, your self-talk, you might be saying, I'm terrible. I'm never going to get good at cricket. Or I'm terrible at bowling. I'm terrible at batting, whatever it might be. I'm never going to get good at the sport. And it's those kind of unhelpful thoughts that then lead to then feeling sad and wanting to give up. So part of learning your ABCs is recognizing that we go through a process of A, B, and C rather than going straight from A to C. And then from that, actually that skill that I've talked about there is based on a lot of the work that the US Army have done on building soldiers' resilience. And the US Army has spent over $100 million on building soldiers' resilience. Learning your ABCs is their foundational skill. And then they've got 6 other skills that follow on from that. There's a really good book called The Resilience Factor, about 10 or 15 pounds on Amazon, that go through these 7 skills. And the other one that's probably worth just briefly mentioning is being more self-aware. So once you're more self-aware of your beliefs and thoughts, and the best way to do that is actually to verbalize that. Rather than keeping your thoughts to yourself, actually speaking your thoughts out aloud can be really, really powerful. If you don't feel comfortable speaking them out aloud, even the act of writing your thoughts down can be really, really useful. But then once you're able to do that, you're then trying to understand some of the thinking traps that we're all susceptible to as individuals. So it could be things like jumping to conclusions, mind reading, where we're kind of second guessing what someone else is thinking without any evidence or facts. Really good one is personalizing. I know when I got feedback from a coach, I thought that was a personal attack on me rather than just generic feedback. So personalizing is another thinking trap. Another really good one is what's called magnifying and minimizing, is where we magnify the negatives and minimize the positives. You could have had a brilliant game. There was one small thing that didn't go so well, and you magnify that one negative, but you minimize all of the other really good things that have gone well. And then, like we talk about in coaching, once you're able to identify those thinking traps, it's just asking yourselves good questions to help avoid some of those thinking traps. So if you are someone who magnifies the negatives and minimizes the positives, is there anything positive I can take from this situation? A nice question that can help just unpick some of those beneficial aspects of it. If you're someone who jumps to conclusions or mind reads quite a lot, a nice question you could ask is, have I got all the information? Have I got all the information to be having that particular thought or having that particular judgment? So I always make a point, Lewis, that actually resilience and the challenge mindset is not about positive thinking. It's not about changing negative thoughts into positive thoughts, but it's about recognizing that there is an alternative way to view a situation. There is always another perspective. There's always another.
You put in your team sort of directives. I think you mentioned about how humor plays a role in team environments for resilience. But even in this context, I know that through recognizing these thinking traps, you can use curiosity and fun and humor to think almost, oh, okay, look at me, I'm magnifying this situation. Oh, I'm catastrophizing this situation. And isn't that interesting that my brain is doing that? And you can use that fun and humor. Again, it helps detach from the situation. So I always found that really interesting. It was at the end of the paper that you'd written that humor was a factor, and I loved it because that just is so true. You think about people who are that so self-deprecating sometimes in themselves, but with a humor side to it, that makes them just deal with it. It manages the situation and that side of it.
Yeah, and I think the word you used there was actually curiosity. I think for me, one of the key aspects of resilience actually is about developing your self-awareness, because actually once you're more self-aware about how you think and recognizing that how you think influences how you feel and behave, I think you're then more in a position to be a little bit more vulnerable and actually explore these things with the overall intention around just improving your own personal and professional development. And that's why for me, the bit about, you just said there that, oh, I'm magnifying here. I think that can only happen if actually you verbalize those thoughts rather than just keeping your thoughts internally. Again, if people don't feel comfortable verbalizing it, articulating, even the act of writing it down can be very, very useful. But I think what that does, either speaking your thoughts or writing down your thoughts, it just brings those thoughts to life. And it means that it's more at the fore, and you can actually develop that self-awareness by actually recognizing where it comes from, rather than necessarily just keeping those thoughts to yourself. So, yeah, I think that curiosity, that self-awareness for me is a really important starting point, because once you're more self-aware of that and open to the fact that we are all humans and we have certain ways of thinking, of the thinking trap I've had to work on the most, for example, is personalization. Both in my sport and also in my university role at the moment, is taking feedback on, detaching it from me as a person in relation to the task. But that takes time. I always make the point that resilience and anything psychological, in the same way within our sport that we work on the technical and tactical side of things, resilience and the psychological aspect needs to be worked on daily, weekly, because otherwise, you'll get back into those traps that you're used to because of habit. So I guess, resilience development doesn't happen overnight. It's something that needs to be worked on, daily, weekly, and incorporated into practice.
Yeah, and again, saying that it's a proactive process that you do. It's like anything. You go to the gym, you just stop going to the gym, you're going to start to atrophy, and it's the same. I was really curious about the personality characteristics, because in this paper, you're developing individual and team resilience, I realized a lot of the personality characters were quite widespread. So it was like every personality trait that you could kind of think of. There was one that really interested me was narcissism. Like there was narcissistic behaviors in there, and also perfectionistic behaviors. Those characteristics, is that what you found? It's not saying that you have to have these characteristics. These are just some of what could be in someone who is showing resilience.
Yes, that's right. So we're not at all suggesting that you need to have all of them, and we're not even actually suggesting that necessarily all of them are equally relevant. The two that you just mentioned there, actually, perfectionism is a really, really interesting one.
Yes.
Going back to what you said about why is it that actually young people now, or why is it we're hearing more people talking about resilience? I actually do think that there's a really nice, there's a link between perfectionism and resilience. We've got a PhD student at the moment who is actually looking at that link between perfectionism, the climate that's created, and also resilience. Interestingly, although probably in that paper we talked about perfectionism and resilience linked together, there is a lot of research now suggesting that actually, people might think that perfectionism, they talk about adaptive perfectionism and maladaptive perfectionism, but actually we know now that actually perfectionism is not a trait or a characteristic that we want to kind of encourage in individuals, because we know they have many negative kind of consequences with that. So perfectionism is probably linked to lower levels of resilience, I would probably argue. The one I find really interesting, actually, there's probably two. Optimism.
Yeah.
And the reason I find it interesting, because it's not, I don't know if we kind of clarified this in the paper or not, I don't remember, but it's not about being unduly optimistic. I prefer the term having kind of realistic optimism, because I think if you are just solely, wishful thinking, solely positive, then actually you don't necessarily need to recognize where maybe some of the barriers are to solving certain issues. So I think, yes, a degree of optimism is important when it comes to resilience, but I think there needs to be a realism attached to that as well. That's why I think realistic optimism, I think, is quite important. And then the other trait, which I think, again, introversion versus extroversion, I think that's also, and there's no clear evidence with that, in terms of people might automatically think that those who are more resilient are probably more extroverted. But actually, the one really good thing about being introverted is you've got generally better skills at reflection and self-awareness and reflection from being introverted. So I think there are pros and cons, I guess, with both. But yeah, introversion and extroversion is quite an interesting.
My interpretation of it as well was, especially with it being extroverted, also having narcissism in there, it got my mind thinking, which was a really great point you made about introverts reflecting, because you need that reflection process. But from an extrovert's point of view, and having narcissism, this idea of sort of grandiosely showing that you are resilient or you have resilience, that almost feels like another fuel to it. So I just reflect on my own. Once people started telling me I had resilience, I then characterized myself and identified myself as, okay, so when I'm met with a challenge, I just turn the resilience up. Like, this is what I do. And these are the tools and techniques in which I do it and how I go about it. That, for me, was quite an interesting, as I'm reading through it, I'm going, yeah, that makes sense. Even wanting to demonstrate the competence to others, like being able to do that and being able to show people, look, I can do this. I remember games doing this, and I'm like just running my mind through it going, what narcissistic behavior that was.
I probably, there's another one that kind of linked to that, showing the competence, is actually wanting to prove others wrong. I imagine that kind of plays a role for sure. But I think with narcissism, I think we've just got to be a little bit careful that we know, I guess, from the research, that aspects of that can be useful, particularly for elite levels of performance. But maybe in a team environment, let's say you've got a selection of narcissists, does that then have an impact on obviously team functioning? But also, we don't really want to be encouraging narcissism, let's say grassroots, or kind of people kind of coming through the system kind of more broadly. But yes, I think some of the research in sport, it's certainly not my area of expertise, but yeah, some element of that can be useful. But again, as with all of these things, it's the balance, I guess, with that. It's a balance between these different personalities. It's the balance of all of these personality characteristics in its entirety, rather than necessarily them in isolation. That's important.
Let's take a little bit of a turn with the steering wheel into team environments. And I really want to talk around facilitative environments. So the challenge and my word, I've just lost it. Your matrix around challenge and support. Yeah. I'd love for you to describe that and how that plays a role, because you mentioned early on in the podcast about the coaches that you had and the feedback, and I'm assuming you experienced that low support. So yeah, let's talk through the challenge support matrix and how that plays out.
So this challenge and support matrix goes back to what we talked earlier on about resilience not being solely individual, but also resilience being environmental. And we have developed, again, based on the research, this 2x2 matrix, which suggests that from an environment point of view, the two things that coaches, and actually it's not just coaches, actually, I talk about the environment being everyone's business. So that's managers, that's coaches, that's parents, I think, involved in that. Everyone plays a role when it comes to creating that environment. Obviously, senior leaders kind of set the tone and set the culture, but every resilience and the environment is everyone's business. So yeah, challenge and support were the two kind of areas. It actually has come from education. It's now been applied in sport and business and other areas. And on the vertical, you've got kind of high challenge and low challenge. And on the horizontal, you've got high support and low support. And as a result, you've got 4 different types of environments. So the 4 environments are bottom left, where you've got low challenge and low support, is what we call a stagnant environment. Bottom right, where you've got high support and low challenge, is what we call a comfortable environment. Top left, where you've got high challenge and low support, is what we call an unrelenting environment. And the environment that we obviously suggest is most beneficial for resilience development is the environment on the top right, which is both high challenge and high support. And that's what we call a facilitative environment. And I guess what I try to do with coaches, and people find this a really useful exercise, is to kind of think about, firstly, in your team setting, what environment do you think that you're in?
Yeah, this was a great piece. This is why I loved what you created here, just because I think you can instantly look at it and go, I've been in that environment, I've been in that environment, I've been in this one. And then when you actually think about what environments you've been in the past, what do those environments look like? Can you characterize those environments? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What are the relationships like, let's say, between athletes and coaches or athletes and management? What do you notice in that environment in the short term, medium term, and long term? And then once you start to able to pick out some of those characteristics, you can then figure out in your environment where you're heading towards. If you're, let's say, the unrelenting environment, high challenge and low support, if you're able to identify some of those characteristics, I call those kind of red flags. In an unrelenting environment, you're going to get people who are going to get burnt out and they're going to drop out of the sport. Now, if in your environment, if you're starting to realize there's quite a big turnover, or people are dropping out, people are burning out, that doesn't automatically mean you're in an unrelenting environment, but it probably suggests you're moving in that direction. So I think for me, hopefully, that makes it just helps people to think about the characteristics of each of those environments. And then ultimately, I guess the question to think about is what can be done to create, in the long term, what can be done to create high challenge and high support from coaches, from athletes' point of view. Yeah, I feel the unrelenting environment is a very old, traditional sort of what you see, carrot and stick.
Yeah.
And that seems to be it. And do you know what? Having played in places like Australia, I think Australia has that environment quite a lot, because sometimes they pride themselves on getting through those environments. What I think you're missing is the fact that you don't realize that if you were to support people a little bit more, keep the challenge, all for keeping the challenge. Don't turn that dial down necessarily, but just support them a little bit more. And I think that there's so many factors that goes into that I even have looked at it and gone, there's sometimes cultural issues that go on here where it's just not the norm to support people in those environments. It's like, get through it and try deal with it. And it's like, well, that's not really helping anyone. But yeah, I think I've even seen this across countries where it's like each of those environments sometimes are rewarded, even admired for getting through those. I think even interesting, you spoke about the army. People would think that it's an unrelenting environment. And you see these shows like SAS Who Dares Wins in the UK, where they're just screaming at the participants and like, this is what we do in the SAS. I don't think that's always a real realistic representation of what those environments are. There is actually support going on. They do look after each other because you need it.
I think for me, Lewis, you've just hit the nail on the head there. And the unrelenting environment is the environment I talk a lot about with coaches and with other teams, because they feel as if I need to put players in an unrelenting environment to prepare them for elite competition. And I'm really adamant that I do not think we need to have anyone in an unrelenting environment. Exactly what you just said there, that you can have challenge and you can, but as long as if you support people alongside that, going back to our definition of resilience as the ability to maintain performance and well-being when under pressure, in an unrelenting environment, it's all about performance. There's very, very little care about the individual, their well-being, their own personal development. Whereas in a facilitative environment, it's about the person and the athlete, but crucially, you're interested in their performance and their development and their well-being. And I guess the conversation I always have with coaches is coaches will often say, well, if I'm being challenging, I can't be supportive. And if I'm being supportive, I'm not being challenging. And we kind of discuss that quite a lot. You can be challenging and supportive at the same time and have an impact on their performance and well-being at the same time. They don't need to be two separate things. I want to give one example of this where there's a real danger of, and it actually goes back to terminology. You mentioned about the fact that the unrelenting environment is that old traditional way of thinking. But I would say even recently, you mentioned also different countries. You mentioned Australia, I think Canada, you hear stories out there where it's basically been that winning at all cost culture, where we're doing it for the purposes of performance, of winning medals, winning trophies, whatever it might be, at the expense of athletes. I'm sure some of your viewers might be aware of the White Review that came out in relation to British gymnastics, maltreatment and abuse in the sport. There was a 300-page review into that particular culture. And what was quite interesting was that the culture to develop resilience, and I'm putting resilience in inverted commas for a particular reason, the culture to develop resilience contributed to what Anne White found in her conclusion was that the culture to develop resilience contributed to the maltreatment and abuse within the sport of British gymnastics. When you dug into the review in more detail, and this is a quote that's direct from the report, there were coach curriculum materials as recent as 2020 along athletes on the performance pathway, where resilience was being defined as the ability to suffer.
No way. They defined it as the ability to suffer.
Resilience as the ability to suffer. And Lewis, this was as recent as 2020. We're talking about 2 or 3 years ago. The coaches in their coach curriculum, in their coach education, were being taught that resilience is the ability to suffer.
But where was that curriculum coming from? That was just being made up. That was to
if we're being blunt about it, that's being made up, I don't know, either made up or being based on coaches, I guess, personal intuition or personal experiences, what they've done in the past.
So it's completely anecdotal.
Yes. But what I'm saying is it's being made, it's being brought into coach education. And I guess for me, then it's not a surprise. That's why for me, that language, people might think, oh, you're getting a bit technical or academic about, describing what resilience is. But that's why it's so important. Because actually, if we're not on the same page about what resilience is, if we think it's the ability to suffer or the ability to endure, the ability to push through without giving up, then you're going to get coaches who are going to provide lots and lots of challenges in the name of resilience. But actually, then it's going to actually have the complete opposite effect that you actually want to have. And, the idea about support, I think that's a really interesting conversation as well. Support for me is not just around the arm around the shoulder. It's not just about emotional support. Support could be as subtle as providing a justification and a rationale as to why you are providing that challenge. Coaches will often say, we're doing this in training because of X, Y, and Z. If you're providing a challenge, provide just a justification. We're trying to challenge you in training because we want you to be able to perform in competition. So we're doing this in training to give you the preparation to do so. Have that conversation with parents so they know, they're aware of the fact that their kids are being challenged for X, Y, and Z. It might have a short-term impact in terms of their performance, but you're not interested in the short term. You're more interested in terms of their medium to long-term development. And then the support could be the debrief. At the end of that challenge, find out from that athlete, how do they find that challenge? Do you need to increase that challenge even further because it was just way too easy? Or do you actually need to increase the support in terms of developing some of those personal qualities or developing that learning and reflection that's needed as part of that process? So support can be quite subtle. It doesn't necessarily need to be that emotional support around the shoulder. But yeah, just wanted to give that example of that unrelenting environment, because I think hearing so many things and it's just for me, there's no need to be in an unrelenting environment. Like there's no benefit. There are many more negative consequences with that, and you don't need to just have high challenge without any support, in my view, anyway.
Would you throw accountability into that form of support as well? I think sometimes, what I'm seeing now is athletes that are coming to me and wanting a conversation is they're almost like craving this accountability, whether they're not admitting to it, but they're like craving that accountability. I just need to be held accountable. I need someone to say, right, I tried this out, I gave it a go. Now what do we do? That review and reflection, but like that accountability and going, okay, look, you messed up here. Like, that's fine. We're not going to, we don't judge you any further than that. This is just a failure. What do we want to do next time? And it's like you said,
in one of our papers, sorry to interrupt, in one of our papers, we characterized each of the 4 environments that I talked about. And the exact word that you use there, we've used in our papers, is that individuals crave, in a facilitative environment, individuals crave that constructive feedback. So feedback ends up actually being a two-way process rather than it just being, let's say, coach-driven or whatever that might be. And also, individuals, rather than actually challenges coming directly from the coach, individuals take that accountability that you mentioned there, where they'll come to the coach and say, for my own personal development, can we do this in training so that I can become better, etc. So actually that it goes back to individuals being proactive, whether that's seeking out feedback, setting goals, seeking challenges. I think that craving bit and also that proactive nature is a really important part of the facilitative environment, alongside, like we talked earlier, an environment where people can learn from mistakes, an environment where people can try new things, experiment without that kind of fear of judgment. Because I think that's also a really important part where actually we know from an innovation decision-making point of view that actually when people are quite creative, that's when they're innovating and having the best decision-making. But you need an environment that allows that to happen.
It's quite interesting by the way you characterize support there of it not being the arm around the shoulder, because I think it's so easy for media and in general for people to look at resilience and then promote it as this suffering. You go through pain and suffering in order to grow and get better, but there's not that conversation around the support, because that's really easily talked about in a very soft approach, and that's one that I'm going to generalize here, but men would potentially sort of deter away from. I think there may be some room for being able to bring a sort of harder conversation around support, like what support, how it can be. I guess tough love is not the right word, but being able to make it look more hardened rather than people straight away thinking, okay, support is arm around the shoulder, are you doing okay? And then you could very easily start to get into a comfortable environment. And yeah, talk to us about what a comfortable environment might look like and potentially how people start to get out of that.
Yeah, and I think actually that you're right in the sense that I've had conversations with coaches at the moment where, because of all the media around maltreatment and abuse and the winning at all cost culture, my fear is actually people move from that unrelenting environment and then go the other way completely, where they go comfortable. And that in itself, like you said, I don't think that's right either. There is that kind of fine balance between challenge and support. Yeah, a comfortable environment is high support, low challenge. I guess one thing to categorize is that in a comfortable environment, actually personal development and well-being is pretty good. It's very, very good, actually. But in a comfortable environment if you're in a comfortable environment for a sustained period of time, you're probably unlikely to have high levels of performance. But that doesn't necessarily mean, I always talk to coaches that actually at certain parts of the season, being in a comfortable environment where there is more support than there is challenge is absolutely fine. It depends on what's relevant to the context, what's relevant to the time point. So there might be certain parts where you think, actually, I want my players, I want our group to be in a comfortable environment, and that's okay. It's just recognizing the fact that if you're in a comfortable environment for a long time, then yeah, that's unlikely to be high performance. But in a comfortable environment, I guess there is sometimes difficult conversations are avoided in a comfortable environment because people obviously just want to feel as if they're getting on with one another. But actually, in a facilitative environment, you can have these really open and honest conversations with one another without anyone taking it personally, recognizing the fact that there is that trust and respect that you can check and challenge one another because you're doing it for the benefit of the individual or doing it for the benefit of the team. Whereas in a comfortable environment, some of those difficult conversations might be avoided. Maybe in a comfortable environment, there might also be an area of complacency, possibly. about what's kind of needed to perform. Again, potentially, let's say in an elite environment. But yeah, generally speaking, as I said, I think, there's nothing in the same way that I think there is actually lots of damaging consequences of being in an unrelenting environment. I don't actually think there's nothing wrong per se of being in a comfortable environment. Grassroots, whatever, it might actually be a beneficial thing, but possibly for elite performance, it's possibly not the most beneficial for a sustained period of time.
I would even say at a club level where you were talking about elite performance, I'd even say like elite performance, so trying to move your performance into a better direction. Pressure training. So actually adding this in. When does pressure training, how can it be done well to create resilience? And can there be a risk of moving it to an unrelenting environment when you bring it in?
Yeah. Simple answer is yes. I think there is a danger if pressure training is not done well. There's been whole bodies of research actually around pressure training in terms of what needs to be done when, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. Happy to share that with any listeners who are interested in that. Yeah, got to be careful with pressure training in terms of otherwise you might have the opposite intended consequence by actually providing lots of challenge without that kind of support. I think it's just being mindful of understanding how that pressure has been viewed by that individual, because that will then determine, do you then need to increase that pressure even further, or do you need to increase that support? And that is very much an individual conversation or an individual, that's kind of your skills as coaches to be able to actually see from that athlete's point of view about what's needed in terms of that challenge and support. But I would actually say that pressure training can be done in small quantities, even at a relatively young age. It doesn't need to be, these massive kind of pressures that you're providing in training, small little bits and pieces. There's a really nice piece actually of some researchers out in New Zealand, in Netherlands, and what they call planned disruptions. So you kind of provide these kind of planned disruptions, using, I worked with a swimming team who was training, and I'm sure you can, this can be with cricket, with any other kind of sport, where they're in their club, they were training in some of the best facilities. And then when they went to competition, when they went to pools where the facilities weren't so great, what they realized that some of their swimmers really, really struggled to actually move to other pitches, to move to other locations, move to other pools. So what we got them to do was to train in these actually poorer swimming pools. So they actually had the experience. That's not pressure in a traditional sense, but it's just getting them to experience something different that they wouldn't necessarily be experiencing day to day. Getting play. I'm sure people have heard about getting players, increasing the level of competition, particularly for some talented players, getting them to play up a little bit to show how they're experiencing that. But then obviously that debrief is really important in terms of how they've done. Umpiring decision-making, poor umpiring decision-making, in the context of other sports, refereeing decision-making, making poor decisions in training. So again, they have the experience of dealing. Now with cricket, it's actually really difficult because once a decision is made, you can't really come back. Whereas with football or with other sports, with VAR and things like that, you've got that. You've got opportunities to help individuals react better to poorer official or refereeing decision making. But it's just being creative. I think just being really, really creative in training, but doing it in a way where you're actually seeing how are people reacting. Crucially, I think that's the important bit. Is not just providing the challenge that is pressure training. I think it's what you do around that challenge, how you're supporting that individual, how you're debriefing, how you're getting them to reflect. That's the bit that will actually result in some subsequent levels of resilience.
Well, a previous guest on the show was Graham Winter, but I actually got to work with Graham Winter out in Australia. So he was sports psychologist for Australian Olympic team. And we were working in cricket at the time. And one of the sessions we created for these young cricketers was essentially talking. It wasn't even the skill part of the training was very simple, very, very simple. But we created like what did we judge them on? We judged them on their reactions to situations, but we asked them before they went into the training session to write down, when you're put under pressure, when the pressure increases, what are we going to see? And we asked them to define it for themselves and what we would physically see, what maybe they would even be saying to themselves. And they wrote it on a whiteboard and it literally sat at the end of the net. So then we went and did the training session, and the training session was simply hitting the ball into certain zones, and you got runs and points and scores. And at the start of the 6 ball over, we would say, this is the target. This is what you're trying to achieve. And we would start. But then what we did is we threw in some disruptions. And when, let's say they got down to the last ball and they needed 2 runs, and they sort of iron up the 2-run target, just before the bowl was about to start, we would say, no, it's 4. And we set that rule out. We said, whatever happens, their rules could change. Yeah. And what you found was these guys started bargaining with you. They started trying to convince you that that was not right. And the brilliant thing that we then told them was like, look, you may face this. The game doesn't care about your feelings. Sport doesn't really care about your feelings. You have to place how you deal with that situation. You have to do that. You have to create that situation, your reaction to your how you work in that environment. And they were just bargaining. They were doing all. Look, this is not changing, but you are now presenting a different version of yourself than what you've said. How can we improve that? And then we debriefed after and saying, what would we do in order to change that and get closer to how you actually want to be rather than how you actually are. So it was a really interesting, really tangible way in which we did it, and it was so fun. It was funny at the time because the bargaining that was going on was brilliant.
Yeah, and I think going back to, I guess, my own personal experiences, I think back to it and think if I had a little bit of pressure training in my development, I probably just didn't have enough pressure that when it came to competition, I would actually go as far as saying I probably froze and choked under that pressure. Possibly, this wasn't the full reason behind it, but possibly because, just didn't have it, that training or that pressure kind of training in kind of day-to-day environments. And I think that definitely plays a role in, and it can be done, as you said, it can be done in a fun, quite creative way, but also having some really tangible outcomes alongside that. And part of it is, look, if you can recreate as much as you can in training, that's obviously even better. But even in a team setting as well, even actually role playing, like even discussing it. In sports psychology, we often use the phrase, what if scenarios. What if this were to happen? How would you individually react and respond? But also, how as a team collectively would we react and respond? Even if you can't recreate that, even having those discussions, role playing some of that information, I think that can be really useful and really, really, helpful.
I love the changing of environments as well, putting people into like really different environments, going to like bad facilities. I know, I forget Michael Phelps's swim coach, but it's Bowman. I think it's Bob Bowman. That's his coach's name. He used to do things where as they're about to dive into the pool, he'd rip their goggles off and things like that and get them to swim lengths in that, because it was just getting them ready for a situation that could happen. And it's
but
really
Lewis,
tough
with that particular example, it did actually happen.
Did it?
Yeah. So in that particular case, ripped the goggles. And what happened was, I think in one of his Olympic finals, completely, I don't know if it was a chance or what happened, his goggles filled up with water.
Wow.
So in some cases, some of these you can't always create for eventualities, but using that example there, actually something that was trained did happen in a very crucial, Olympic, I think it was an Olympic final or a World Championship final, but a very, very high level kind of competition. Yeah.
I get really worried when I hear young athletes talking about, the facilities were no good and things like that, because I'm like, well, game day could be even worse. That could be, it's a really good, tangible thing to do, is to find yourself a challenging environment, which doesn't have to be the pressure that's being placed on you. I think a lot of coaches will think of, okay, I need to turn up the consequences. I need to get them to run. I need them to do all sorts of things that are physically challenging. Whereas actually just being in a new environment, a new facility, a different facility could be all that is needed to create pressure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you saw the Bell study that was the 2-year study on, I know it's mental toughness, but their framework within it of the 4 sort of day cycles was a really nice way of looking at it. And I took from it, because I do a lot of running and cycling and got into zone 2 training and training better like that. Almost see pressure training as being able to be like that, where you do your easy sessions, say easy in inverted commas, but you do your skill training, and then you have 1 day a week. If you're doing 5 a week, let's say, you have one where you put in pressure, and then you reassess. And I sort of looked at that Bell study and the way they would plan, train, review, but have pressure training in there as well, and then they cycle that through. I thought that was a really neat way of tangibly creating a program. Yeah,
and the other thing, again, it's not necessarily linked to pressure training specifically, but you mentioned about having a day specifically around that. I would also have another day. I think there is actually Hockey Do. I don't remember the name now from the top of my head. Do they call it Thinking Thursdays? Or maybe I'm simplifying this a little bit too much. But what they do is actually one day where a school has done this, what they called Failure Week. Wimbledon High School did it, where basically it was a week for them to just try new things, experiment. And I actually think in sport, a day or a session where athletes or individuals are given the opportunity just to experiment, try something, whether that's technique, whatever it might be, just experiment, try new things without that fear of judgment or retribution, because I think that's where the innovation and decision-making kind of skills kind of come in. So in the same way that you're kind of suggesting, pressure training day, I actually think a day of, I don't know whether what we call it failure or whatever, but a day of experimenting, a day of creativity. I think, is it called Thinking Thursday? Something along those lines that Hockey do. The other thing, the other example I think, which I think is really interesting, particularly actually with a sport like cricket, fatigue. I find fatigue really interesting because I think there's a lot done physically around fatigue, but psychologically, decision making when you are tired. Like, use the example of football, the amount of goals that are scored in the last few minutes of the game is actually, I don't know the exact percentage or stats around it, but I imagine it to be pretty high. Like, for example, in cricket, we talk, we practice, or we get bowlers to practice the last over that they're going to bowl, in terms of the death over. But do we get them to practice once they've played 30 overs already or 40 overs already, or do we just get them to practice it at the start of a training session? Now, with fatigue, that's where developmentally we've got to be a little bit careful. We're not going to do that, let's say, with a 12-year-old, for example. So I think for me, the other bit about pressure training is making sure it's progressively adaptable, but also developmentally appropriate as well. But yeah, I just like that example. Well, I've always thought about the example of fatigue is, particularly with a sport like cricket, test match, or even one-day games, which can go on for a number of hours or days in some cases. How can we help individuals become better at making good decisions when they're in those in that state? And I don't know if we do enough around that.
Yeah, I used to do it myself. I used to actually go and do a lot of I would do my running sessions. So not physics. So what I would do is I wanted to practice under fatigue. I did, whether I did this right or wrong, but I actually sometimes wouldn't eat. So I'd be fatigued. I'd be almost hungry. But that was just one-off training. I'm not doing this all the time, and I don't recommend it. But I'm putting myself internally into a state where it was really challenging, and then I went and did my skill. And this could have just simply been trying to bowl a normal stock line and length ball rather than doing real death stuff and high pressure and high consequence. It was actually, can I just physically do this with my legs a little tired, or could I actually do a gym set? I would sometimes do a heavy gym session the day before and then choose to bowl the day after, because I needed to learn that in cricket, you got a 4-day game. I needed to wake up, be sore, be stiff, and figure out what it was that I needed to do in order to perform better that day. Because in a game, you can wake up and it feels like you've been hit by a car. And actually, you wake up on day 2, day 3, you need to know, what is it gets me into a good place, and can I actually deal with this discomfort in order to perform at the same level? So yeah, it's a really good point, really great point, and one that definitely people should take note. Look, Mustafa, we've gone through some time here. I realise we've gone over, but this is a amazing conversation. I've really enjoyed this, and one that I feel we haven't even touched on things like perfectionism and resilience and the link there. So maybe even in the future, if you would be willing to come back, we could delve into stuff around that.
Yeah, no, sure, more than happy to. Yeah, really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope it was useful for your listeners.
Just before we go, is there any sort of last comments that you want? I do always have one question that I ask guests before they leave. Is there anything that you are recommending, whether it's a book, a film, a documentary, quote that you have used that you have found inspiring or thought-provoking?
Yeah, I guess 2 points. I guess the quote that I would use, and it goes back to the environment bits that we've talked about, I often use this quote, is when a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. And I came across something on LinkedIn about helping coaches to think like gardeners and farmers, in terms of they're not often thinking about the crops, they're thinking about the soil around it, etc. And I'm sure we can take that analogy a little bit further. So, rather than think, often when it comes to resilience, we focus on the individual, we focus on the flowers. We don't think about the plant food, the watering, the sunlight, etc. So I think the more we can think about the environment that we're creating, I think that will help to take ownership and accountability that resilience is everyone's business, I think. I think for me, the last point I would mention as well is, you mentioned this earlier on about schools. I've seen this in clubs and organizations where their mission and values are around, you'll always now see resilience as being one of their philosophies or values or missions. But I guess the danger that I've seen is that resilience ends up being a bit of a tick box exercise. And I think we've just got to be really, really careful about that I often get asked, Mustafa, can you come into our team and organization and do a webinar or workshop on resilience for us? And I'll say, yeah, look, I'm more than happy to do a workshop or webinar, but ultimately that's not gonna, if you're thinking that that's ultimately gonna automatically develop resilience, education provides food for thought, but it doesn't always provide food for action. So I think we've just got to be careful that with resilience being a bit of a buzzword, resilience doesn't just end up being, okay, we've now done a workshop, we've done a webinar, we've now ticked the resilience box, let's move on. We've got to think about resilience as sustained change, cultural change, environmental change over a period of time, rather than just as a one-off initiative or a one-off CPD activity. Because I think that will lead to sustained change over time.
It's a great point, and as a part of that, being proactive rather than reactive with it, I think is a huge point from today. Mustafa, thank you so much for your time. Where's the best place for us to point people to see more of your work, to maybe reach out, contact you if they want to do that?
Yeah, so university website is probably a good starting point. If you just typed in, I guess, Mustafa Sarkar, Nottingham Trent University into Google, my staff profile, my staff email address should be there. I'm also on LinkedIn, but also on Twitter. Use that quite a lot for tweeting around sport and performance psychology at MUSSARKAR. And then, from a research point of view, as academics, we use a platform that's called ResearchGate. Because sometimes I know, particularly with coaches, it's always quite difficult to get access to research because they're always behind paywalls, which is always really frustrating for me because I've always been someone who wants to do research to actually have an impact. So I guess, put it this way, if you come across an article that you've seen, have a look at ResearchGate because all of the articles there, you can actually request it and then the request comes to me directly. And I'm obviously then more than happy to share research papers and things like that. Don't feel as if you ever have to pay for any of them. Just request them directly via myself and I'm obviously more than happy to share. So yeah, staff webpage, LinkedIn and Twitter, and then ResearchGate are probably the best places.
One question I didn't ask actually is where are you? Is there anything you're heading into now that you're looking to research and sort of areas you want to dive into?
Yeah, so from a resilience point of view, actually, there are two projects. I mentioned the one around perfectionism and resilience, which we're starting to look into a little bit further. We've also got a project looking at parental resilience.
Interesting.
But particularly parental resilience in a youth sport context. And actually, again, for listeners, we've got a PhD student who is actually towards the end of his PhD, looking at developing an intervention for parents, particularly in youth cricket. So if people are aware of, or if you are parents yourselves who are looking to develop your own resilience, and you've got young kids who are on that kind of journey, cricket journey, please just get in touch, because I'm sure Devesh will do more than, you would be really appreciative to hear from parents who will want to be part of this intervention. So yeah, the parental resilience piece is one area that we're looking at. And then we also have a colleague called Ben Ashdown, who is looking at developing an observational tool of resilience behaviours in academy youth football. So again, if anyone's in that kind of space, either working in that setting and wanting to help test this observational tool that we're developing, so actually looking at on-pitch resilience behaviours and seeing actually if we can assess resilience in that way, that's another project that we've got going on as well.
Amazing. Look, I will leave all the links in the show notes for what you previously mentioned, but Mustafa, this has been an amazing conversation. I've really, really enjoyed this one, and I'm sure I'll be reaching out again to have you back on in the future.
Thanks, Lewis.